The number one issue I heard throughout the last campaign cycle as I was knocking on doors was the rise in burden of property taxes and the need for a property tax release, as I'm sure many of you in this chamber could attest to. Increasing property taxes is the most regressive way to raise revenue to pay for essential programs and services. Simply put, it impacts hardworking families and those on fixed incomes the hardest. It can literally tax people out of house and home. While property taxes are determined by a particular municipality, a town or city government, the state impacts it by creating what I would call a manufactured crisis for towns and cities, driving them to raise either fees associated with local services or to raise property taxes. Those are the only tools municipalities have. They could also make cuts, reduce their budgets, including schools, but many across our state have already cut down to bare bones. Increasingly, there isn't much left to cut before you start impacting the quality of service. The Property Tax Fairness Credit, formerly known as the Circuit Breaker Program, has been a successful initiative to provide direct relief to Maine residents to reduce their overall tax burden. Unlike the homestead exemption, there is a means test for the eligibility of this tax break to ensure it goes to the folks that need it the most. Under the tax credit, eligible Maine taxpayers may receive a portion of their property tax or rent paid during the tax year on the Maine individual income tax return, whether they owe Maine income tax or not. This bill before you, Mr. President, requires that 1% of surplus general fund revenue be transferred annually to a non-lapsing fund to be used to increase the maximum property tax fairness credit. In layman's terms, if we want to provide much-needed relief to property taxpayers, we as a legislature need to quite literally put our money where our mouth is. I'm not talking about new resources or new appropriations needed to fund it. I'm simply talking about just 1% of any extra money that comes into the state to either expand the eligibility of the tax credit to reach more taxpayers or increase the amount of money we send out to eligible folks. So we shouldn't have a large fiscal note, which is great. Of late, we've been fortunate to be in a surplus environment, Mr. President. Our economy has been inching out of the recession, which is fantastic, and as a result, greater revenues have come into the state coffers. Again, on this bill, I would remind us all that we recently dumped $30 million into the rainy day fund with surplus funds. I love scenarios, so let's give you one. If we run a particular scenario where, let's say, we take that $30 million that was poured into the coffers, under this bill, we would simply ensure that $300,000 would go towards investing in the property tax fairness credit. So that is a more than fair outcome, Mr. President. I think that's fantastic. So yes, no one legislature can bind the next, but I think setting into the record a firm suggestion of where our extra resources should be spent is important for all of us in this chamber to do to provide much-needed property tax relief. Thank you, Mr. President.